Across 4 games, From Software has built worlds full of things that can end you. Dragons that level cities, gods that refuse to let go of power, plagues that rot entire kingdoms from the inside out. But in every one of those worlds, there is always one figure that stands apart from the rest. One character that the world itself seems afraid of. This is about those characters, one from each game. Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring. 4 figures that represent the most feared forces in the entire franchise. And fear, in these games, has nothing to do with difficulty. A boss can be hard without being scary. What makes a character truly feared is the scale of what they represent. These are beings that embody world-ending ideas, forces that the settings themselves could barely contain. Every one of them changed the rules of the world they lived in, and every one of them left a scar so deep that the game makes you feel it in how you play, in what you lose, and in what the world looks like after they are done. What ties all 4 of them together is a pattern. Each one represents a catastrophe that can be traced to a single cause. A grave gets opened, a dragon gets wounded, a soul gets consumed, a seal gets broken. And from each of those moments, the world around these characters warps in ways that can never fully be undone. The fear they create goes beyond what they do to the people around them. These characters change the world itself by existing in it. We are starting in Dark Souls with the character who may have the most disturbing origin story in the entire franchise. A being called Manus, Father of the Abyss, and the reason he is feared has almost nothing to do with how strong he is. The story of Manus begins with a kingdom called Ulasil. It was a land of sorcerers, a place built around knowledge and magic, home to people who believed they understood the forces around them. Ulasil had structure. It had royalty, including a princess named Dusk who would eventually become one of the most important witnesses to the disaster. For a time, this kingdom had peace, but beneath the surface, deep in the earth below Ulasil, a grave sat untouched. Something had been buried there for a very, very long time, and the people of Ulasil made the worst decision in the history of their civilization. They dug it up. A character in the game named Marvelous Chester tells us exactly how this happened. According to Chester, the people of Ulasil upturned the grave of primeval man. They excavated something ancient, something that predated their entire society. Chester says they did this because they were fooled by a toothy serpent into thinking it was safe. The game never confirms which serpent he is talking about. 2 serpents exist in the Dark Souls world, Darkstalker Kath and Kingseeker Frampt, and either one could have been the deceiver. Chester's words point a finger, but the game is careful to leave the identity hanging. What the game does confirm is the outcome. The deception worked. Ulasil's people opened the grave, and Chester says that act incited the ornery wrath of the being inside. That being was Manus, and his sole description in the game contains a line that reframes everything about the disaster that follows. Manus was clearly once human. His humanity went wild. Those 2 sentences carry enormous weight when you sit with them. No ancient demon had been sleeping underground. No god or dragon had been waiting in the dark. The most feared being in the first Dark Souls game, the creature that would nearly swallow an entire kingdom, was a person, or at the very least, something that used to be one. His sole description adds a second detail that becomes the emotional engine of the entire story. Manus was eternally seeking his precious broken pendant, a small personal item, a relic from whatever life he had before the grave. The in-game description of the broken pendant tells us it carries a distinct feeling of both reverence and nostalgia. It also says the pendant holds a power that men of this time can neither manipulate nor sense. The people of Ulasil did not understand what they had disturbed, and they definitely did not understand the emotions still tethered to the being they pulled from the ground. Power had nothing to do with what Manus wanted. He was looking for something he lost, and the search was tearing the world apart. An NPC named Elizabeth, who lives at the edges of the kingdom while the disaster unfolds, delivers the clearest account of how bad things got. She says an abyss was begat of the ancient beast. She says it threatens to swallow the whole of Ulasil. Those words deserve to land because they describe the scope of the problem in the simplest possible terms. An entire kingdom. Everything these people built. Their homes, their history, their way of life. All of it threatened by a spreading darkness born from one being's fractured mind. And Elizabeth goes further. She says the abyss may be unstoppable. That word, unstoppable, coming from someone who is watching the situation develop firsthand, tells you everything about the fear this event created. Elizabeth has watched the abyss grow, watched it eat through the foundations of a civilization, and she is telling the player, as directly as the game allows, that there may be no way to undo this. She also mentions that Knight Artorius came to stop the spread, but that Artorius lacked a murmur of dark, and that the abyss swallowed him. The person sent to save Ulasil was already gone. The abyss spread through the kingdom, the way a disease moves through a body. It crept into the foundations and warped everything it touched. The residents of Ulasil, the sorcerers and citizens who had lived there for generations, were twisted by the darkness into shapes that were barely human anymore. Their bodies changed. Their minds went with them. Ulasil had been a place of light sorcery, a kingdom where magic was tied to understanding and learning. The abyss ate through all of that. Streets that once held life became passages filled with warped creatures that used to be neighbors. The architecture of a thriving city became the shell of a tomb, its walls still standing, but its purpose completely hollowed out. Every layer of Ulasil that the player descends through tells the same story. The deeper you go, the worse the corruption gets. The closer you move toward the source, toward Manus himself, the less recognizable anything becomes. And the fear that creates for the player mirrors the fear that the characters in the story must have felt as they watched their home dissolve around them. There was no front line to hold. There was no enemy at the gates. The enemy was underneath them, growing in every direction at once. The reason behind the destruction is what makes Manus stand apart from other feared beings in the franchise. Most apocalyptic forces in these games are driven by power struggles, by gods trying to extend their rule, by cycles of fire and dark playing out across centuries. Manus was driven by a pendant, a trinket from a life he could no longer remember clearly. And the proof of that motive does not come from speculation. It comes from someone who experienced it firsthand. Princess Dusk of Ulasil was taken by Manus. She was pulled into the abyss and held there, preyed upon in the darkness. When she speaks about what she experienced, she does not describe a rampaging monster. She says she sensed a wrenching nostalgia. She says she felt lost joy coming from the creature that held her. She sensed an object of obsession and a sincere hope to reclaim it. And then she says something that shifts the entire story. She wonders out loud whether this creature is perhaps no beast after all. The game doubles down on this idea through a sorcery tied to Manus called Pursuers. Its in-game description says it grants a temporary will to the darkness of humanity, and then it describes what that will looks like. It reflects envy, or perhaps love, and it pursues its target relentlessly, even if the pursuit ends in tragedy. And speaking of reach, the game demonstrates just how far Manus's influence extends through one of the most startling sequences in all of Dark Souls. When the player first obtains the broken pendant in the present day, a dark rift opens. Manus's hand reaches through time itself, grabs the chosen undead, and drags them backward through centuries into the past, into the era when Ulasil is actively falling apart. There are no followers sent ahead, no traps laid in advance. His hand physically punches through the gap between past and present and pulls the player to him. The broken pendant carries a power that men of this time can neither manipulate nor sense, and yet Manus bends it instinctively, without thought, propelled entirely by his fixation on the lost item. His obsession bends time. His grief rewrites the rules of when and where the player exists. In a franchise full of powerful beings, Manus is one of the only characters whose emotional state can alter the actual structure of the world. Once the player arrives in the past and begins to descend through Ulasil's ruins, the full scale of the disaster becomes clear. The chasm of the abyss lies at the bottom, the deepest point of the corruption, where the darkness is thickest. And waiting at the bottom of that chasm, surrounded by dark energy that pulses with his every movement, Manus stands. He has become enormous. His body is distorted, barely recognizable as something that was once human. The outline of a person might still be there, buried under layers of wild humanity and raw abyss energy. But what faces the player is a towering figure of darkness that fills the arena. His arms swing wide. His presence dominates every inch of the space. During the fight, dark sorceries come in waves. The pursuer's spell tracks the player with that same relentless quality described in its item text, homing in and refusing to stop. Other dark magic rains from above, making it hard to find a safe moment to breathe. The space feels closed in, suffocating, like the weight of the abyss is pressing from every direction at once. Fighting Manus does not feel like a duel. It feels like being trapped inside someone else's breakdown, where every swing and every spell is another wave of emotion crashing outward without control. The game gives you a specific countermeasure designed for this moment. The silver pendant, which was originally presented to Knight Artorias for facing the abyss. Its description says it effectively deflects the dark of the abyss, especially in its magic forms. The existence of this item is a statement about how seriously the abyss was treated as a threat. Normal shields, normal armor, normal resistance meant nothing against this kind of darkness. A relic had to be crafted from the ground up with the sole purpose of pushing back what the abyss could throw at a person. And even with that relic, even with a tool specifically built to counter the dark, the person it was made for still fell. But before Artorias lost himself completely, he did one last thing. He had traveled into the abyss with a companion, a great grey wolf named Sif. When Artorias realized the corruption was going to take him, he used the last of his strength to shield Sif from the dark. The kingdom was already lost. His mission had failed. His own mind and body were slipping into corruption, but he could protect his wolf. That single act, performed in the middle of the worst disaster Ulasil had ever seen, is one of the most emotionally loaded moments in the entire game. Artorias lost everything except the ability to make one final choice, and he used that choice on loyalty. The payoff comes later, in a way that hits most players harder than any boss fight ever could. If you rescue Sif in the past during the Ulasil crisis, and then encounter Sif as a boss in the present timeline, an alternate version of the encounter plays. Sif recognizes you. Across all the centuries that have passed, across the entire gap between then and now, the wolf remembers the person who helped. The fight still happens. Sif still stands in the way. But that flicker of recognition, that brief hesitation from a creature who has been carrying the memory of that moment for ages, gives the encounter a weight that almost nothing else in the game can match. Here is the part that the world of Dark Souls never figured out. Artorias did not stop the abyss. The player is the one who actually ended it. The chosen undead, ripped through time against their will by Manus himself, descends into the chasm of the abyss and fights the father of the abyss at the very bottom of the darkness. Sif can even be summoned inside the arena as an ally during this fight, standing beside the person who is finishing the job that Artorias started and could not complete. After Manus falls, the abyss recedes and Ulasil survives the disaster. But the kingdom never truly recovered from what happened beneath it, and the memory of the abyss lived on long after Manus was gone. In the centuries that follow, the history books remember Artorias as the one who stopped the darkness. His legend was built on a version of events that did not actually happen. The real hero vanishes from the record entirely, unnamed and uncredited. The fear around the abyss was so overwhelming that the civilization that survived it needed a simpler story, one where a great knight walked into the dark and won through sheer courage. The truth that a stranger dragged backward through time by the monster itself was the one who ended the threat was too unsettling to carry forward. So they rewrote it. They gave the victory to a name people already trusted and let the real story disappear. That is what fear does on a cultural level. It changes the stories people tell themselves, because the truth is harder to sit with than the legend. The game leaves one last detail that makes all of this feel even heavier. Manus is called Primeval Man by Chester. That phrase has fueled years of community discussion about whether Manus might be connected to the furtive pygmy, the first being to discover the Dark Soul at the very beginning of the Dark Souls universe. The game does not confirm this. The link between Manus and the pygmy is suggested by the phrasing, but never stated outright. However, the possibility adds an enormous amount of weight to the fear surrounding him. If Manus is tied to the origin point of all humanity in this world, then the abyss is not something that happened to the world by accident. It is something that was always embedded inside the world, sitting in the foundation, waiting for the wrong person to pull it loose. The people of Ulasil thought they were uncovering their own history. They thought they were performing an excavation, digging up the ancient past to learn from it. Instead, they released a grief so old and so concentrated that it nearly swallowed their entire world. Knights could not fight it. A relic designed to push it back could not save the person who wielded it. An entire society of sorcerers, people who had spent their lives studying forces beyond normal understanding, were helpless against what came out of that grave. The only thing that stopped the abyss was a stranger from the future, someone who was never supposed to be there, fighting at the bottom of a ruined city in a battle that history would go on to credit to someone else. That is what made Manus feared above all others in Dark Souls. The destruction he caused did not come from malice or ambition. It came from inside the most basic part of being human. The same nostalgia and loss and longing that make people who they are became, inside Manus, the same force that almost unmade a kingdom. Ulasil did not fall to an army or a curse. It fell to a feeling that no one knew how to contain. And in a franchise full of gods and dragons and world-spanning cycles of fire, the thing that came closest to ending the world before anyone could stop it was a broken heart buried underground, waiting to be disturbed. Somewhere beneath the earth, in Dark Souls 2, there is a city that was built around a sleeping dragon. The people who lived there did not stumble onto the dragon by accident. They found it, they recognized what it was, and they made a choice that would define every part of their civilization from that moment forward. They built their entire world around the creature, their architecture, their religion, their daily rituals. Everything in the city of Shulva, Sanctum City, revolved around keeping one dragon asleep. And the fear that sin represents in this franchise comes from a single terrifying idea. What happens when the thing your entire civilization was designed to contain finally wakes up? The Crown of the Sunken King, DLC, tells Sin's story through the ruins of the city he destroyed. Unlike most locations in the Dark Souls series, Shulva was a functioning civilization that ended in a single event, a catastrophe triggered by one wound, and the entire DLC is designed to walk you through what that event left behind. Shulva was governed by a figure known as the Sunken King. He oversaw the construction of the city and its sanctum structures, all of which were built around the resting place of the dragon Sin. The city was described as magnificent. A king raised it while the dragons slept soundly beneath it. That image alone tells you something about the relationship between Shulva and Sin. The dragon was the entire reason the city existed. Sin was treated as something divine. The people of Shulva revered the creature, and they organized their lives around making sure it stayed exactly where it was, undisturbed, deep in slumber. The most important part of that containment effort fell to the priestesses of Shulva. According to the in-game description of the Sanctum Priestess Tiara, the priestesses sang to preserve the dragon's deep slumber. That detail sounds almost peaceful when you first hear it. Priestesses singing to a sleeping dragon, keeping it calm through ritual and devotion. But the same description adds a line that undercuts all of that comfort. It says there is doubt about whether the song ever reached the dragon's ears. That single sentence changes the entire picture. The people of Shulva built their way of life around keeping Sin asleep. They trained priestesses, created rituals, and sang to the dragon every day. And the game quietly suggests that none of it may have mattered. The dragon may have been sleeping on its own terms the entire time, completely unaware of the effort being made to contain it. Shulva's entire identity may have been built on a ritual that did nothing. The Sunken King also had a queen associated with his rule. Ilana, the Squalid Queen, is tied to the kingdom in secondary lore summaries as a consort figure. Her exact role in the events surrounding Sin is told indirectly through items and context, and the game leaves much of her involvement open to interpretation. What the game makes very clear, though, is the relationship between the city, the dragon, and the disaster that connected them. That disaster began with outsiders. A knight named Sir Jorg led a group called the Drakeblood Knights into Shulva with a specific goal. They were after dragon's essence, and their motivation was not greed in the traditional sense. The lore attached to the Drakeblood Knights describes their purpose in terms that go far beyond treasure hunting. They sought dragon's essence to achieve a true understanding of life. They wanted to transcend what they considered a banal existence. These were people who believed that something inside a dragon's body held the key to a higher form of being. Gold and territory had nothing to do with it. They were trying to steal something spiritual, something they believed would elevate them beyond the limits of ordinary life. That framing matters because it turns the invasion of Shulva into something more unsettling than a standard siege. The Drakeblood Knights came to take from the dragon the one thing the people of Shulva had spent their entire civilization trying to protect, and they did not come quietly. Jorg led what amounted to a full siege of the sanctum, cutting through whatever stood between him and the dragon resting at the center of the city. The priestesses and their songs could not stop armed invaders. The architecture designed to preserve slumber could not repel a military force. Every layer of protection Shulva had built was oriented around keeping the dragon undisturbed, and none of it was designed to handle an army that had come specifically to disturb it. Jorg made it to Sin. He got close enough to strike the dragon directly, and according to the description of Jorg's ring, that strike drew the dragon's essence. In that moment, every safeguard Shulva had built fell apart. The priestesses and their songs, the sanctum architecture, the careful devotion of an entire culture. All of it collapsed in the span of a single wound. Because when Jorg drew from the dragon, Sin responded. The description says Sin spewed forth the poison that had long brewed within him, blanketing the city in a miasmic cloud. That line is the hinge of the entire Sin story. Poison that had long brewed within him. The game is telling you that this was not a sudden reaction. The poison had been building inside Sin for an unknown amount of time, growing and compounding while the dragon slept. Shulva existed on top of a pressure vessel, and no one in the city, not the king, not the priestesses, not anyone, understood what was accumulating inside the creature they worshipped. The singing may or may not have reached the dragon's ears, but even if it did, it would not have stopped what was happening inside Sin's body. The poison was brewing regardless. The containment measures Shulva had in place were designed to keep the dragon asleep. They were never designed to address what was happening inside the dragon while it slept. That distinction is the gap that brought the whole city down. The only question left was what would eventually cause the poison to come out, and how much of it there would be when it did. Jorg's spear answered that question. The moment the dragon's body was pierced, the stored poison erupted outward and covered the city. Sin's soul description compresses the entire event into one of the most striking images in the franchise. It says, "The rain of toxins toppled the city." That is the game's way of describing an extinction event at the local level. No army conquered Shulva. No rival kingdom brought it down. No political collapse weakened it from the inside. The city was toppled by what came out of the dragon it had spent its entire existence trying to keep asleep. The poison fell like weather. It blanketed the streets and the sanctum halls and the homes of every person who lived there. The miasmic cloud that Jorg's ring describes did not target specific buildings or specific people. It covered everything. An entire civilization ended in the time it took for the dragon's body to empty itself, and there was nothing anyone inside the city could do to stop what was already in the air. The soul description also notes that the sunken king had erected this magnificent city while the dragon slept soundly. That detail matters because it makes the timeline clear. The dragon's slumber was the condition that allowed the city to exist. The magnificence of Shulva was only possible because Sin stayed still. Every grand structure, every sanctum hall, every achievement of the sunken king's rule was built on borrowed time, held in place by a sleeping creature that could end all of it the moment it stirred. The foundation of the city's greatness was also the source of its destruction, and the game makes sure you understand that connection before the catastrophe hits. The soul description then adds a final line that the game never fully explains. After describing the fall of the city, it says the event restored the dragon's purity. That phrase sits at the end of the catastrophe like a question mark. Purity through the destruction of a city. Purity through the expulsion of poison that had been building for ages. The game leaves the meaning of purity deliberately open. Whether the poison was something foreign that had infected Sin, or something the dragon had been producing naturally over the course of its long sleep, is never answered. The ambiguity is deliberate. What we do know is that the city paid the full price for whatever that restoration required, and that Sin emerged from the disaster changed, emptied of something that had been weighing on him from the inside. Jorg himself did not survive what he started. After striking the dragon and triggering the catastrophe, Jorg's spear description says he disappeared into the eternal sanctum. The man who led an invasion to take something transcendent from the dragon was swallowed by the very place he violated. He never left Shulva. He never returned with the understanding he came for. The Drakeblood Knights who followed him into the city, looking for a higher form of existence, instead found the end of everything the city had been. Their quest for transcendence triggered an event that buried them alongside the people they invaded. There is a dark symmetry to that outcome. The invaders and the invaded both ended up in the same tomb, trapped together beneath the poison cloud that neither side could escape. The Drakeblood Knights wanted to move beyond a banal existence, and instead they became part of the ruins. Jorg wanted to draw something divine from the dragon, and the divine thing he found was the destruction of everything around him, including himself. The way the game lets you experience Sin as a player reinforces everything the lore establishes about him as a feared presence. Before you ever reach the final confrontation at a location called Dragon's Rest, you encounter Sin earlier in the DLC. He appears, makes his presence known, and then retreats. That is an unusual design choice for a boss in this franchise. Most bosses are waiting for you in a room at the end of a path. Sin lets you see him first. He gives you a preview of what is coming, and then he pulls back, leaving you to continue through the ruins of the city he destroyed. By the time you reach the actual fight, you have already walked through the aftermath. You have seen what the poison did. You have moved through the sanctum that was built to contain him and watched how thoroughly it failed. The boss encounter does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives after the game has spent hours showing you the consequences of the creature you are about to face. And when the fight finally happens, Sin introduces a mechanic that turns his lore into something you feel in your hands. His body is corrosive. When you hit him, your weapons take damage, rapidly. Community documentation on this fight emphasizes that Sin's body can wear down weapon durability so quickly that it threatens to leave the player without any way to deal damage at all. Your sword, your axe, whatever you brought into the fight, starts falling apart the moment it touches the dragon's skin. The instruments you rely on to survive become weaker with every swing. Players going into this fight unprepared can find themselves holding a weapon that is close to breaking, watching the durability meter drain in real time, and realizing that they may need to swap to a backup just to stay in the fight. Sin forces you to think about something most boss encounters in the series never make you worry about. You are not just managing your health and your stamina. You are managing the structural integrity of the thing that keeps you alive. That mechanic tells the same story as Jorg's spear. The act of striking Sin comes with a cost. Jorg drew from the dragon and triggered the end of Shulva. The player hits the dragon and watches their weapon crumble. Contact with Sin is inherently destructive to whatever makes contact with him. The poison, the corrosion, the toxicity that lives inside this creature works in both directions. Whether you are a knight seeking transcendence or a player trying to finish a boss fight, the result of touching Sin follows the same pattern. Your tools fail, your means of offense dissolve, and you are left standing in front of something enormous and ancient with fewer and fewer options every second. That feeling of helplessness is the core of what makes Sin feared in the Dark Souls 2 world. In most boss encounters across the franchise, the threat is direct. A boss hits hard, moves fast, has attacks you need to learn and openings you need to find. Sin does all of that, but he adds a layer underneath it that messes with the basic contract between the player and the game. You are supposed to be able to fight back. You are supposed to have a weapon that works as long as you swing it properly. Sin quietly takes that away from you the longer the fight goes on. Every hit you land is also a hit against yourself, eating into the durability of the only thing standing between you and total helplessness. The fear he creates in the moment of the fight mirrors the fear that defined his entire story. Shulva had tools to manage the dragon. Those tools stopped working when the pressure got too high. The player has tools to handle a boss. Those tools start breaking the moment you make contact, and that fear maps perfectly onto what happened to Shulva. The people of that city lost everything gradually, then all at once. They had their rituals, They had their priestesses. They had their walls and their sanctum and their faith in the sleeping dragon. And one wound, one act of greed from an outsider, caused all of those protections to become meaningless overnight. The poison did not care about devotion. It did not spare the faithful or reward the careful. It blanketed the entire city without distinction. Shulva's identity, built around the reverence and containment of a divine creature, was dissolved by the very thing it was built to honor. The locations in the DLC reinforce this on a visual level. The dragon's sanctum, the place that was engineered as a temple to preserve Sin's sleep, is one of the areas you explore as you move through the ruins. Walking through those halls means walking through a monument to failure. Every room was designed with a purpose that no longer exists. The architecture tells a story of devotion that ended in catastrophe, and the game makes you spend real time inside that story before it lets you confront the cause. By the time you reach Dragon's Rest and face Sin in his final awakened state, the weight of the entire collapsed civilization is sitting on the encounter. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the way Sin's story frames fear compared to other threats in this franchise. Before Yorg arrived, Sin was passive. The dragon was sleeping. The priestesses sang. The city functioned. Sin was feared because of what he could do if he woke up, and the people of Shulva organized their entire existence around making sure that never happened. The fear was preventive. It was structural. Every part of Shulva's identity was a response to the question of what would happen if containment failed. And when it did fail, when one outsider punctured the seal with a spear, the answer turned out to be total and complete. Nothing in the city partially survived. The whole thing was toppled. Sin's story in Dark Souls 2 takes the idea of fear and makes it environmental. Where the previous game showed a catastrophe driven by emotion and longing turned loose, Sin's catastrophe is driven by pressure, by something internal that accumulates over time and then releases all at once. The dragon did not choose to destroy Shulva. The poison was already inside him, brewing, building, waiting for something to crack the seal. When Yorg provided that crack, the dragon released what he had been holding, and the release wiped out everything around him. Sin is feared because he represents the kind of threat that does not need intent. He does not need a motive or a plan. The danger is just there, inside him, growing, and the only thing separating that danger from the world outside is a boundary that could break at any moment. The soul description's last line lingers long after the story is done. The rain of toxins toppled the city, but restored the dragon's purity. Somewhere inside that sentence is an answer the game refuses to give. What does it mean for a dragon to be pure? Was the poison something wrong inside Sin, something that needed to come out? Or was the poison always part of him, and purity just means being emptied of what made him dangerous? The game leaves it open, but the implication that an entire civilization was destroyed as a side effect of a dragon's body correcting itself makes the story even more unsettling. Shulva may not have fallen because of rage or revenge. Shulva may have fallen because the dragon could not hold the poison any longer, and the city happened to be standing in the way when it came out. That is the fear of Sin, a sealed disaster, a sleeping catastrophe with a city wrapped around it, a creature that did not need to be angry or vengeful to end everything nearby. The poison was always there. The people of Shulva knew it was there. They sang to keep it contained. They built temples around it. They organized their laws and their faith and their daily lives around the idea that if they were careful enough, devoted enough, the dragon would stay asleep and the poison would stay inside. And in the end, one spear wound from one outsider was all it took to turn everything they had built into a grave. The priestesses sang, the dragon slept, and none of it saved them when the moment finally came. At the end of everything, when the fire has almost gone out and the world is collapsing into ash, the last fight in the Dark Souls trilogy takes place between two people standing in a field of dust at the edge of time. One of them is the player. The other is a slave knight in a red hood who has been walking longer than any god or king in the entire franchise. His name is Gale, and the reason he is one of the most feared characters From Software has ever created is because he chose to become the thing the world should be afraid of. He saw it coming, he knew what it would cost, and he walked toward it anyway, because the only thing waiting on the other side was a new world that someone he loved could call home. Gale's story spans 2 full DLC expansions in Dark Souls 3. It begins in the first one, Ashes of Ariandel, and ends at the very bottom of the second, the Ringed City. That structure matters because it means the player meets Gale as a person long before they fight him as a monster. By the time the final encounter happens, you already know who he was. You know what he wanted, and that knowledge makes the fight land in a way that almost nothing else in the franchise can match. When the player first meets Gale, he is an NPC, a wandering slave knight in a tattered red hood, described in his soul description as a red-hooded, wandering slave knight. Slave knights were historically disposable in the Dark Souls world. They were the lowest class of warrior, the ones thrown at problems first because losing them cost nothing. Sent into situations where survival was unlikely and sacrifice was expected, slave knights existed to be spent. Gale was nobody. He carried no title and held no legendary status. The weapon on his back had no storied past. He was a servant among servants. And yet, by the end of the trilogy, he is the last person standing at the end of time. Kings, lords, and gods across the entire Dark Souls universe have crumbled into nothing by the point where you face him. Gale outlasted them all, and he did it through nothing except sheer refusal to stop moving forward. In Ashes of Ariandel, Gale serves a young girl known as the Painter. She lives inside the painted world, a kind of pocket reality that exists within a canvas. The painted world has become overrun with rot, a decay that has settled into every part of it and made the place unlivable. The Painter needs it to be burned away so she can start fresh and paint a new one. Gale asks the player, the Ashen One, to bring a proper flame to burn away the rot. He is a guide in this DLC, someone who points you in the right direction and trusts you to do what needs to be done. He can even be summoned as an ally during certain encounters in this phase of the story, fighting alongside the player as a companion. That detail matters for later, because it establishes who Gale is before the world breaks him. He is helpful. He is loyal. He is an old servant doing everything he can to protect someone he cares about. After the events of Ariandel play out, the Painter reveals what she needs to create the new world. She calls Gale Uncle, and she says that Uncle Gale will bring the pigment, colored like the dark soul of man. That line sets the entire second DLC in motion. The Painter needs a very specific material to paint her new world. She needs the dark soul itself, the original soul discovered at the very beginning of the Dark Souls universe, the one tied to the earliest humans. And Gale has already left to go find it. He has walked away from the painted world and into the dying remains of reality to track down the oldest human power in existence, because a girl he calls his lady asked for paint. The Ringed City DLC is framed as a journey to the world's end. That language appears in the DLC's own description. The player travels downward through a place called the Dreg Heap, which is exactly what it sounds like. As the Age of Fire reaches its final moments, all lands converge into one collapsing pile. The Dreg Heap is that pile. Entire kingdoms, entire histories, entire civilizations stacked on top of each other like layers of sediment, crumbling inward as the world runs out of time. You can see fragments of places from earlier in the game buried in the rubble. pressed together like pages in a book that someone crushed in their fist. The player descends through this wreckage toward the ringed city, a location described as an isolated place at world's end, gifted to the pygmies by the Great Lord, along with his beloved youngest daughter, Filianor. The ringed city was given to the pygmies, the earliest humans who found the Dark Soul, as both a home and a cage. It sits at the very edge of the world, and the lore around Filianor suggests that her presence there is what kept the city separated from the collapse happening everywhere else. Filianor's role in the story is tied to one of the most debated moments in the trilogy. Her slumber is associated with a kind of barrier that isolates the ringed city from the decay happening to the rest of the world. Community analysis has long discussed whether Filianor's sleep creates a literal space-time separation, or whether it masks the city's true state behind an illusion. The game leaves the exact explanation unresolved. What it does show, clearly, is the result. When Filianor's egg is broken and her slumber ends, the world around the player changes. The ringed city falls away. The structures crumble. The sky opens up into something flat and lifeless, and what remains is a barren landscape of ash and ruin, stretching to the horizon with nothing left alive. The transition is sudden and total. One moment you are standing in a city that still has shape and form, and the next you are standing in the aftermath of everything. The world has finally caught up to itself, and somewhere out in that emptiness, Gale is waiting. By the time the player reaches that final arena, Gale has already completed his mission. He found the Pygmy Lords, the ancient beings who originally held the Dark Soul. But what he found when he got there tells you everything about how far gone the world really is. The key item tied to this moment, the one that explains what happened, states clearly that when Gale came upon the Pygmy Lords, he discovered that their essence had long ago dried. The world had been dying for so long that even the original holders of the Dark Soul had dried up. There was nothing left to take. The soul existed only as a residue inside their withered bodies. History had burned through everything. The fire had consumed the fuel, and the fuel had consumed the people who first carried it. So Gale consumed them. He ate what remained of the Dark Soul's carriers, because it was the only way to get the pigment the painter needed. That act, consuming the dried remains of the oldest humans in the world, is the moment where Gale's mission and Gale's humanity come apart. He crossed the entire dying world to find the Dark Soul, and when he finally arrived, the only way to carry it back was to put it inside himself and hope that someone would come along to take it out. His boss cutscene captures the horror of that transformation in a single demand. He turns to the player and says, "Hand it over. That thing, your Dark Soul, for my lady's painting." There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that he is still talking about the painting. He has consumed the Dark Soul. He has crossed the entire world and arrived at the literal end of time. His body is mutating. His mind is fracturing, and the first thing he says when he sees the player is a request, framed in the language of duty, to hand over the last piece of what he needs. The mission is still running inside him, even after everything else has broken down. The slave knight is still trying to serve the painter, even though the thing he has become could never walk back through that door and hand her a brush. The fight itself takes place in a field of ash under a grey sky. There is nothing left of the world except dust and ruin. The arena is one of the most visually empty spaces in the entire franchise, a flat expanse with almost no features, designed to make you feel the weight of how much has been lost. This is the endgame of the Dark Souls universe. The kingdoms are gone, the thrones are empty, and the fires have all burned out. There is just Gale and the player, two figures at the bottom of history, fighting over the last thing that matters. The grandness of the trilogy, the gods and the dragons and the linking of the flame, all of it has collapsed into this one flat stretch of nothing. And the final conflict is between a nobody and another nobody, which is maybe the most honest thing the series ever did. After 3 games of cosmic stakes, the last fight comes down to 2 people standing in dirt. Gale's weapons tell his story through wear and damage in a way that few other characters in the franchise have matched. His greatsword is described as the only weapon that he kept from beginning to end, stained with the residue of countless battles. That line is a biography written in rust. Gale has carried this sword since the beginning of his journey, and it has seen every fight along the way. His repeating crossbow is described as having been used in the battles of an endless journey, made brittle from overuse. The word brittle is doing heavy work in that sentence. Gale's crossbow is falling apart the same way the world is falling apart. His equipment has the same exhaustion as the setting. Everything around him, the landscape, his weapons, his body, is running on fumes. And yet he keeps fighting, because the mission has not been completed. The developer even treated Gale's weapon as a distinct mechanical identity. An official patch for Dark Souls 3, patch 1.14 released on Steam, included specific balancing changes to Gale's greatsword, adjusting its attack power and stamina consumption. That is a small detail, but it matters. The developers saw Gale's sword as something worth tuning on its own terms, as a weapon that needed to feel a certain way in the hands of anyone who picked it up. Even at the level of game updates and patch notes, Gale was treated as a system unto himself. What makes Gale feared is the nature of what he represents in the timeline. The Dark Souls trilogy is fundamentally about the cycle of fire. Gods try to extend their rule. The fire fades. Someone links it or lets it go. That cycle has defined every major conflict across 3 games. Characters have fought over it, sacrificed for it, and built entire civilizations around managing it. Gale exists at the very end of that process, after the cycle has ground itself to nothing. He is standing in the wreckage of everything the trilogy spent 3 games building, and he is the last person still moving. The thrones are empty, and the bonfires have gone cold. The kingdoms that the player walked through across all 3 games have been reduced to the ash under his feet. And in the middle of all that silence, one slave knight is still trying to finish a job. He is the last human doing the last human thing, trying to take what remains of the world's oldest power and turn it into something new. His soul description frames his quest as seeking the dark soul as pigment. That purpose, turning the soul of the world into art supplies for a child, is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire franchise. It takes the grandest possible stakes and makes them small and personal. The dark soul, the origin of humanity itself, reduced to paint for a canvas, and the tragedy of it is baked into the structure of the story. Gale knew the dark soul would likely ruin him. He said as much through his soul description. He understood that his body and mind would not survive the process of collecting it. The plan was never for Gale to bring the pigment back himself. The plan, if there even was one, was for Gale to absorb the dark soul, become the vessel that carries it, and then for the player to take it from him. He turned himself into a container. He made his own body the delivery method, knowing that the delivery would require someone else to bring him down and collect what spilled out. That is a level of self-sacrifice that goes beyond anything else in the trilogy. He accepted that he would fail, and then he built that failure into the plan itself. The painter tells the player, after everything is over, that with the material brought back she will paint a world, a cold, dark, and very gentle place, a goodly home. That world is built from what leaked out of Gale after the player brought him down. The item that the player carries back is described as having seeped from the hole within Slave Knight Gale, used as pigment to depict a painted world. The new home that the painter creates comes from the remains of a slave knight who walked to the end of the world and let himself be destroyed so that someone else could start over. That is the fear of Gale at its fullest. Gale bridges his role between DLCs in a way that strengthens the fear, because you watch the transformation happen in stages. In Ariandel, he is gentle. He cares about the painter. He calls her his lady. He asks you for help. He fights beside you as a summon. Then you hear that he has gone to find the dark soul, and you already know from his own soul description that he expected the journey to end him. He walked away from the last person he cared about, knowing he would never come back as himself. When you finally find him at the end of the ringed city, crouched over the dried remains of the pygmy lords, the red hood is still there. The same figure you met in the painted world is standing in front of you, but he has consumed the thing that created humanity, and his body is paying the price. The transformation happens across the phases of the fight itself, his movements becoming more feral, more uncontrolled, as the dark soul tears through whatever is left of who he used to be. By the final phase, the gentle old man who asked for your help in a rotting painting is gone. What remains is something caught between human and beast, swinging a rusted sword under an empty sky, still fighting because the mission has not been completed, even though the person who started it has already been erased. The fear that Gale creates sits in the gap between who he was and what he became. A slave knight with no title and no legacy walked further than any hero in the trilogy. He outlasted gods and kings. In the world of Elden Ring, the gods live forever. The demigods never fade. The Golden Order, the system of rules that holds the entire lands between together, was built on one foundational promise: permanence. The powerful stay powerful. The divine stay divine. And the thing that could undo all of it, the one force that could bring true ending to any of them, was locked away inside a single living creature. His name is Malekith, and the reason he is feared above all others in Elden Ring is because he is none of the things you would expect. He is a lock. The lock on the concept that the entire Golden Order was designed to erase. The concept of true, final, permanent ending. Malekith's role is laid out clearly in his remembrance description. He is a shadow-bound beast assigned to Queen Marika the Eternal. And Marika's sole need of him was as a vessel to lock away destined death. That is his entire purpose. He exists to hold something inside himself so that the rest of the world never has to deal with it. Destined death is the force that can bring a true and permanent end to the demigods, and Malekith's job is to make sure it stays sealed. Without him, the immortality that defines the Golden Order falls apart. With him, the gods get to live forever, and the system holds. One creature, carrying the weight of a concept that could collapse an entire civilization if it ever got loose. The remembrance then adds a line that shifts everything. Even then, she betrayed him. Marika, the queen he served, the person he was bound to, turned on him. The game does not specify exactly what the betrayal was. Whether she allowed what came next, whether she used him as a tool and discarded him, or whether she set the whole thing in motion on purpose. The remembrance leaves the act itself unnamed, but the emotional weight of those 4 words sits over Malekith's entire story. He gave his body to contain the most dangerous force in the world, and the person he did it for betrayed him anyway. What came next is one of the most important events in all of Elden Ring. The Black Knife print, a key item in the game, states that on the night of the Black Knives, someone stole a fragment of destined death from Malekith and imbued its power into the assassin's daggers. A fragment, not the whole thing, a piece, and that piece was enough to forge weapons capable of ending a demigod permanently. Let that sink in for a second. Malekith was carrying the entirety of destined death inside himself, and a stolen sliver of it was powerful enough to create God-ending weapons. The scale of what he was containing becomes clear when you realize that the fraction that leaked out reshaped the entire political and spiritual landscape of the lands between. The Night of the Black Knives is one of the foundational ruptures in the Elden Ring timeline. It is the night that Godwyn the Golden, a demigod, was struck down using those very daggers. The broader conspiracy behind this event is tied to Ranni the Witch and the Black Knife assassins, and the ripple effects of that night shaped the entire state of the world the player walks into. The shattering of the Elden Ring, the wars between demigods, the broken landscape, the player spends the whole game crossing. All of it traces back, in part, to the night someone cracked the seal that Malekith was supposed to be. Everything that went wrong started because someone managed to take a fragment from the one creature entrusted with keeping destined death sealed. Malekith's seal had been broken, and the world cracked open because of it. His response to that failure is one of the most disturbing details in the game. After the theft, Malekith's weapon description says he bound the blade within his own flesh such that none might ever rob it again. After someone stole a piece of destined death from him, Malekith took the remaining power and pushed it inside his own body. He fused with it. He made himself inseparable from the thing he was guarding, because the only way to make sure no one could take it again was to make the container and the contents the same thing. There is no military thinking behind that decision. That is someone so broken by failure and betrayal that they turned their own body into a vault. Guarding destined death stopped being a duty and became something physical, something grafted into his flesh that could never be separated from him again. This is where Malekith's story splits into two identities that the game asks you to piece together. Before you ever face Malekith as a boss, you can encounter a figure called Gurranq, Beast Clergyman, at a location called the Bestial Sanctum. Gurranq is hunched, feral, and hungry. He asks the player to bring him Deathroot, a substance tied to the spread of destined death's influence through the world. He devours it. He craves it. His hunger is constant and consuming. Community transcripts preserve the line that captures his desperation clearly. Bring me more. The existence of Deathroot tells you something important about the state of Malekith's containment. Even after he sealed destined death inside his own body, the force continued leaking into the world through its roots. The seal had cracks. The containment that cost Malekith his body, that required him to fuse blade and flesh together, could not hold everything in. And Gurranq, the beast at the sanctum, spends his existence consuming those roots, trying to pull the leaking power back into himself, trying to contain what keeps escaping no matter how tightly he holds on. He is doing the same job he has always done, just in a more desperate and degraded form. Where Malekith once held destined death as a duty, Gurranq holds it as an addiction. The hunger never stops, because the leaking never stops. If the player follows Gurranq's questline to its end, the connection between the two identities becomes undeniable, and the grief underneath Gurranq's hunger comes to the surface. Community transcripts preserve his anguished words directed at Marika herself. He calls out to her, asking why she would deceive him, why she would shatter everything. Crumbling Farum Azula is the location where the player eventually faces Malekith as a boss, and it is one of the strangest places in the entire game. Community discussion has long treated Farum Azula as a space that exists outside of normal time, a crumbling ruin suspended in the sky where the rules of the world seem to bend. The game does not provide a clean explanation for why Farum Azula behaves the way it does, and the relationship between Gurranq at the Bestial Sanctum and Malekith at Farum Azula is left unresolved in terms of exact mechanics. But what the game does make clear is that defeating Malekith is required to advance toward the end of the story. He is a progression gate. The player has to go through him to reach the altered state of the capital, Leyndell, which transforms into the Ashen capital after Malekith falls. That transformation is a direct consequence of his defeat. When the lock on destined death is broken, the world changes. The capital itself reflects the loss. The boss fight communicates everything about what makes Malekith feared through a single mechanic. The in-game incantation called Black Blade describes the power that Malekith's weapon carries. It says the blade was once imbued with destined death, and that beyond dealing damage, it reduces the maximum health of anyone it hits and continues to drain their current health over time. That is a mechanic worth sitting with. Most enemies in Elden Ring deal damage that you can heal. Your health bar drops, you use a flask, and the bar fills back up. Malekith cuts into the bar itself. When his blade connects, the top end of your health shrinks. The amount of life you are allowed to have gets smaller. You can still heal, but you are healing into a ceiling that is lower than it was before he hit you. The game is showing you what destined death actually means by making you feel it through the interface. Your maximum existence is being reduced. The upper limit of what you can be is getting cut away. The developers treated this effect as important enough to specifically adjust in a post-launch update. Bandai Namco's official patch notes for version 1.07 list a change to destined death that extended the duration of the effect that reduces maximum HP. That is a balancing decision, but it also tells you that the developers considered the max HP reduction to be the defining feature of this power. When they tuned destined death, the thing they focused on was how long the shrinking lasted. The identity of Malekith's threat at the mechanical level is the removal of your future. He makes you less than you were before he touched you. That mechanic is the perfect expression of why Malekith is feared in the lore. The remembrance and boss summaries state plainly that there was not one demigod who did not fear him. In a world full of powerful beings who can reshape landscapes and command armies, every single one of them was afraid of this creature, because Malekith carried the one thing that could end them for real. The demigods of Elden Ring have power on a scale that dwarfs anything a normal person could touch. But Malekith held the off switch for all of them, and they knew it. The fight itself has two phases that map perfectly onto the two sides of Malekith's identity. The first phase is the Beast Clergyman. He is hunched, aggressive, feral, fighting with the desperate energy of a creature that has been consuming Deathroot and holding itself together through sheer stubbornness. His posture tells a story all on its own. This is a being that has been crouching over its duty for so long that the duty has bent his body into the shape of servitude. Then the transition happens. He speaks the line that defines his entire existence. "Oh, become my blade once more." And the Beast Clergyman becomes Malekith, the Black Blade. The change is immediate and total. The posture shifts from hunched to upright, from grounded to airborne. Malekith launches into sweeping aerial strikes laced with the black-red energy of destined death. The speed changes. The reach changes. The feel of the entire encounter transforms. Where the Beast Clergyman felt cornered and desperate, Malekith feels precise and lethal. The transformation communicates the difference between the grieving beast at the sanctum and the fully realized guardian of the world's most dangerous power. Gurunk is what Malekith looks like when the weight is crushing him slowly over centuries. Malekith is what he looks like when he picks up that weight and turns it into a weapon. And every hit he lands in that second phase carries the max HP reduction that defines destined death. Meaning the longer the fight goes, the less room you have to survive. After the fight, if the player has completed the Deathroot questline, Malekith's final words carry the full weight of his story. He says, "Forgive me, Marika. The Golden Order cannot be restored. That line lands as a confession, plain and simple. The lock on destined death has been broken. The thing he spent his entire existence guarding has been released. The system that Marika built, the one that kept the demigods immortal and the Golden Order intact, cannot be put back together. And Malekith, in his final moment, asks for forgiveness from the person who betrayed him. Even at the end, even after everything she did to him, his last thought is of her.